So remember that we're dealing with the question of women in fiction, right? And Woolf says that there are actually three questions involved in there. So let's look now at fiction, at literature. And one of the things that Woolf notices when she's sort of looking through the history of literature is this paradox, what she calls the paradox of women in literature. So take Shakespeare, for example. Shakespeare lived during what we call the Elizabethan age, and we know facts about women who lived during this time. They were actually pretty much slaves. So wives were beaten on the regular, daughters got forced into marriage. They were not treated very well, right? Because of patriarchy, they were treated as second-class citizens. But, so we know this is a fact, but if you look at literature from the time, if you look at Shakespeare, you see women playing these really important parts in the world. So you have these women with a lot of power, with dominating personalities. So you have women like Cleopatra and Lady Macbeth and Rosalind. And you see this not just with Shakespeare, but with women characters of all periods, in the classical and the modern time. So like women like Antigone, right? Lysistrata. So what is it that explains this paradox of women in literature? And here's where she talks about it. A queer composite being emerges. Imaginatively, woman is of the highest importance. Practically, she is completely insignificant. Although she pervades poetry from cover to cover, she is all but absent from history. She dominates the lives of kings and conquerors in fiction. But in fact, she was the slave of any boy whose parents forced a ring upon her finger. Some of the most inspired words, the most profound thoughts in literature fall from her lips, but in real life she could hardly read, could scarcely spell, and was the property of her husband. So Woolf says that, it's the history and the literature have not, there's a disconnect, right? History's been written badly and it's only been seen from one angle. And it's an angle that misses a lot of the reality there. So, she then goes on to give us kind of it's like a thought experiment. Because again, she's still trying to answer the question, where are all the women writers? And she's like, it can't be the case that women just have been dumb, so why is it's such a puzzle that no woman wrote a word of that extraordinary literature that you see in the British Museum, where every man was capable of song or sonnet, right? Every dude was like Shakespeare, but where are all the women writers? It just seems really random that they're not there. So she ponders and imagines that Shakespeare himself had a sister. We don't know if Shakespeare had a sister. It doesn't matter if he had a sister. We wouldn't care, right? Which is kind of the point here. But Woolf wants to know, if Shakespeare had a sister, what would her life have been like? So she gives us this hypothetical example of Judith and imagines what Judith's story would have been like. So we imagine first that Judith is smart, because we know that genius runs in families. But Judith isn't given the same opportunities that her brother has. So she doesn't get sent to school. It's kind of like Virginia, right? She's not encouraged to read at home. Even if she has some literary talent, she's probably sweeping floors and doing needlepoint and stuff like that. She isn't allowed to experience the outside world, and she isn't given any outlet for her talent. Whereas William is encouraged at every step. Judith is like all women of her time. She's threatened with a marriage that she doesn't want. And so she decides to run away to London to become an actress. Everyone laughs at her because during Elizabethan England, everyone knows that the women characters were actually played by men anyway, because they didn't even think women could act like women successfully. So they all make fun of her, and she has to support herself, so she becomes a man's mistress. She gets pregnant because that's what happens when you become a man's mistress, and she realizes there's no way out, so she kills herself. And it's a terrible, tragic story, but Mary Benton says this is what would have happened to Shakespeare's sister, or something like this. And it would have happened to any woman who had Shakespeare's genius. So she says, to have lived a free life in London in the 16th century would have meant for a woman who was a poet and a playwright a nervous stress and dilemma which might well have killed her. Even if she survived, even if she wrote anything down, her name wouldn't be on it. Whatever she had written would have been deformed and twisted. Her work would have gone unsigned. Some dude would have taken it and put his name on it. And it all goes back to what she calls an enormous body of masculine opinion to the effect that nothing could be expected of women intellectually. So even if Judy's father doesn't read these opinions to her when she's young, she would have seen it, right? She would have internalized that. There always would have been this assertion that you can't do this because you're a woman, and that she would have had to protest against. And it would have been too much. So, after the sad example of Judy, we do get this sort of bright, shining example of a woman that Woolf uses to illustrate the fact that, women have been kind of trying to crawl out of this hole for a while. And Aphra Behn is the woman that she uses as an example here. Aphra Behn had a husband and a bunch of kids, and her husband died. And he was kind of a slimeball, so I think he had some gambling debts that she was responsible for. So she had to write. She had to make a living and work on equal terms with men. So she did this by writing. And Aphra Behn is really I would say the most successful example of a modern woman in the West who makes a living as a writer. And she kind of gets the ball rolling for other women like Jane Austen, right? So Woolf says toward the end of the 18th century, this change came about. And if I were writing history, I would think that this was just as important as the Crusades. And that's when the middle-class woman began to write. So that's when we began to get texts like Pride and Prejudice. But here's where, and I think this is great because Woolf kind of does some shit-talking on Jane Austen because, it's great that women are writing, but she says more needs to be done to allow women to be good writers, and we've got to change the structure of society. So she compares Jane Austen to Tolstoy, and she says, look, Tolstoy writes masterpieces, and Jane Austen writes not masterpieces. She's not Tolstoy. And why is that the case? Because Jane Austen isn't allowed to go out and experience the world. Women like Jane Austen are kept ignorant of sexual matters, and because of this, they're not able to fully convey the range of human life that more experienced male writers like Tolstoy can convey. So all of the fiction that's written by women has been diminished by social restrictions that have limited her experience, and we want women to be good writers. We don't want them to just write. And even then, Woolf says, they're up against masculine values prevailing in society, because when we consider the fact that novels have correspondence to real life, what we arrive at is things like football are considered important, but, fashion and clothes buying, these things are considered trivial, right, because of patriarchy. And those values are transferred from life into fiction. So the things that women write about are not deemed as important because they're things that women care about. So the last thing I want to talk about in this text is Woolf's view on androgyny. And this is where she gets we kind of get back into psychology here, and she gives us this theory of the mind that she has. So she's thinking about the brain, and she says, it's such a weird, we don't know a lot about the mind or the soul. And so she posits, and again, I don't want you to get super scientific about this. Don't scrutinize it too much, but she has this theory that everybody's soul is basically split in half. So she says, in each one of us, two powers preside. We have a male part and a female part. So if you're a biological male, the man predominates over the woman in your brain. And in the woman, your brain, the woman part predominates over the man. So she says, great minds are androgynous. It's when this fusion takes place between the two halves of the mind that the mind becomes fully fertilized and uses all of its faculties. She gets this idea kind of from Coleridge. And the androgynous mind, according to Coleridge, is resonant and porous. It transmits emotion without impediment. It is naturally creative, incandescent, and undivided. So the best example that Woolf gives of a writer with an androgynous mind is Shakespeare. She thinks Shakespeare had the androgynous mind because of the way that he was able to sort of see the world and write women characters, those strong women characters like Cleopatra. So the goal then is for the artist to function not as a male or a female, but as a human, right? As a complete human. And the only way he or she can do that is by fusing the two facets of oneself together, even if your own gender predominates. So it's an interesting view. Virginia Woolf is definitely sort of writing during a time where we have this really binary view of gender. So I think today we are more accepting of the idea that gender occurs on a spectrum. And so my critique of this view would be, sexuality is not black and white. It's not just male and female. And so that's kind of a simplistic view of the human mind. But I do think it's really interesting that she proposes a theory like this. So, to end my discussion of this one, the thing to remember is, Shakespeare's sister is still around today. Judy is still denied opportunities because she's a woman, and what we have to do is work to make an environment that's conducive to women being geniuses like Shakespeare, to being successful individual human beings. And there's a lot that goes along with that, but I think that the message of A Room of One's Own is really clear on sort of how to start, at least. So that is all I have to say about this text. You will watch some Toddlers and Tiaras and talk about that for your voice thread, so have fun.